A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984.
Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on a topic that's, well, it's as vital as it is complex: how we genuinely approach diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI, especially concerning the ongoing fight against racism. Our guide for this deep dive is an insightful introduction from Gilmore Crosby's 2023 book, Diversity Without Dogma, a collaborative approach to leading DEI education and action. So our mission today is to really dig into Crosby's argument. He suggests that many current DEI approaches, despite their best intentions, can actually lead to confusion and division. And more importantly, we're going to try and uncover his proposed collaborative, action-oriented path forward, one that's firmly rooted in the groundbreaking insights of the social scientist Kurt Lewin.
And that really is the core challenge, isn't it? How do we get past the polarization, sort of rigid dogma sometimes, that seems to derail so many crucial conversations about prejudice and inequality? This deep dive hopefully promises to cut through some of that noise and offer a surprisingly practical framework for achieving meaningful, lasting change.
Okay, so let's get into it. Crosby kicks things off with a really powerful quote from Joseph Campbell. "The society is the enemy when it imposes its structures on the individual. On the dragon there are many scales. Every one of them says, 'Thou shalt.' Kill dragon, thou shalt." What immediately struck me, is how Crosby applies this, not just to racism itself, but specifically to what he calls dogma in the fight against racism.
Yeah, that's a compelling metaphor. This dragon of dogma, as he puts it, it really does burn collaboration. Crosby argues that when we get bogged down by these thou shalt proclamations, confusion and division just inevitably follow. And those become major obstacles, right? Obstacles to creating any real sense of kinship or making progress against inequality. When we're divided, the problem just feeds itself.
Crosby makes a critical argument here, one I found, particularly insightful. He asserts that too much of the current DEI approach is fundamentally insight-based instead of action-based. So even when institutional racism is clearly identified as a root problem, the focus often shifts inward to looking inward for bias, rather than taking concrete steps to, dismantle those actual institutional structures.
That's a crucial distinction he's making. The source really emphasizes that, quote, what people think is important, but no more important than what people do.
Mm-hmm.
The call is for a real bias for action. Crosby suggests, and this is interesting, that if you actually bring people together to change things, that process itself will start to change what people think. So the core idea is do practical things to eliminate racism, even if you acknowledge having personal biases.
It resonates. And speaking of things that often divide people, let's turn to definitions. Crosby
lead anywhere concrete.
Yeah, that idea. He points out that semantics, the precise meaning of words, can be a huge source of friction. He observes that most people, generally think of racism simply as prejudice held toward another group. Pretty straightforward, maybe.
It is any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Historian Ibram Kendi's definition. And this connects directly to the understanding that race isn't, a biological fact, but a socially constructed concept used to create hierarchies, negative stereotypes. The book actually gives a vivid example from Jamaica. Even though the population is primarily black, racism, by Kendi's definition, still exists there. It shows up as like prejudice favoring brownings or against Chinese and Indian business communities. It just shows how even within what looks like a single racial group, these harmful dynamics can play out.
Okay, so that's Kendi's view. Now let's look at Robin DiAngelo. She's been a very prominent voice in DEI, no doubt. Crosby acknowledges her significant role in, raising awareness, bringing these conversations into the mainstream, but he also offers a critique. He notes that her approach, quote, offers no clear framework for how to have dialogue and often leads to polarizing debate. And he points out that she tends to attribute this polarization primarily to white participants' defensiveness.
Right. DiAngelo's definition, as Crosby explains it, is fundamentally power-based. She asserts that, quote, Racism occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. And from this, she draws the conclusion that only whites can be racist because, historically speaking, they have held that authority and institutional control across much of the world. It's a very specific framing.
And what are the real-world consequences Crosby highlights? How is that definition actually received, especially by the target audience? It seems like maybe it could create unintended side effects.
Crosby argues that, kind of ironically, while it's intended to clarify, it often creates needless polarization. For many white listeners, it comes across as a blanket accusation. You hear statements like, all white people are invested in and collude with racism, which, understandably perhaps, often leads to defensiveness, not engagement. And for some African Americans, he suggests, it can be misinterpreted, tragically sometimes, as permission for maybe unchecked reactions, leading to interactions that push people further apart instead of building bridges. So it ends up driving a wedge right where common ground is desperately needed, particularly because it focuses on individual microaggressions, those subtle, often unintentional slights and personal blind spots as the starting point, rather than a shared goal.
So if the dogma definitions themselves is part of the problem, how does Crosby propose we move forward? How do we actually build those alliances and, get things done?
Well, his core argument is for adopting Kendi's definition over D'Angelo's, specifically to foster common ground and move past this polarization he sees as needless. He says focusing on individual microaggressions and personal blind spots are just the wrong ways to start diversity conversations. Crosby defines dogma as a belief or set of beliefs that is accepted by the members of a group without being questioned or doubted, which he sees as, undemocratic, and something that just triggers fight or flight responses. The emphasis, he really stresses this, must shift from judging thoughts to building alliances and getting things done.
It sounds like the key then is getting people on the same page about the nature of the problem itself. Crosby highlights a crucial shared understanding, even among thinkers like D'Angelo, Lewin, and Kendi, the assertion that race is a false hypothesis, that it's a social construction of reality, not a biological fact. It exists only beyond, superficial characteristics.
Precisely. And the source gives some powerful historical context for this. The assertion of racism, as we tend to understand it, can actually be traced way back to a 1493 papal decree. Then it was strategically codified into Virginia law in 1691, specifically to divide servant classes, prevent uprisings. Much later, scientists like Blumenbach in 1795 even tried to legitimize it with these unfactual scientific conclusions that led to terms like Caucasian. This whole historical journey just reveals how the very concept of race was deliberately created and then reinforced to justify and maintain power imbalances. The historical context is, it's eye-opening. It really illustrates how systemic this problem truly is. And this is where Kurt Lewin's insights become so incredibly powerful. Crosby highlights Lewin's demonstration that power imbalance and the coveting of the same is the root of this evil. Lewin showed that as long as there's significant inequality, everyone involved, both the powerful and the relatively powerless, become confused and twisted by the inequality. Yeah. It's a really profound insight. Lewin's concept of the person on the margin helps us grasp this sort of universal confusion. This individual, whether they belong to a traditionally marginalized group or even the group in power, experiences this deep sense of disorientation. The source gives some compelling examples. Historically powerless women blaming themselves for societal failings, or Jews under Roman rule questioning their own suffering, and even present-day instances like skin lightening practices you see in Jamaica and India, or the disproportionate fears of violence sometimes held by white Americans. Everyone caught in this dynamic really struggles, to figure out what's personal and what's systemic.
So it's not just that we are on that margin, but as the book says, we are all on that margin, and consequently we are all fragile. The puzzle, then, is truly systemic. It's not purely individual, though individual experience is, of course, undeniably important. Crosby notes Lewin's belief that inequality is a problem for the majority and the minority, and that equality is the only solution. It just shifts the entire focus, doesn't it? Away from individual blame towards a shared responsibility for a systemic issue.
It really does. A fundamental shift.
So, okay, if the problem is indeed systemic and the shared goal is equality, how do we actually move forward constructively? Crosby advocates strongly for Lewin's action research methods. He emphasizes a set of core principles: objectivity, humility, forgiveness, dialogue, collaboration, action. Most of all, even if we are not perfect, we must act out of love. Quite a list.
It really underscores that bias for action we talked about earlier. Crosby and the book's endorsers repeatedly stress that simply having a training where people may learn some of the history or engage in personal introspection is insufficient. And action research, just for anyone unfamiliar, it isn't just about studying a problem, right? It's a cyclical process. You plan, you act, you observe the results, you reflect, and then you plan again, all to solve problems in real-world settings. As Dr. Rodney Coates, who's quoted in the book, puts it so powerfully, trying to change individuals without changing the social environment within which they live is like building one's house on sand.
Mm-hmm.
So the emphasis is clearly on dismantling the actual systemic structures, not just, tweaking individual thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, and that gets right to the heart of it, I think. True change isn't some single event like a one-off training, but a continuous process embedded in culture change initiatives. It's about identifying those systemic elements that preserve inequality, routing them out, and helping people to understand how they can foster real organizational change. Sounds very practical, very hands-on.
Absolutely. And ultimately, this framework encourages us all to, quote, figure out how to lighten up, to be playful yet serious, and crucially, to treat one another with kindness as we tackle these huge, complex challenges. We have to experiment together and not get hung up on expressing our thoughts just right or using the right jargon, because, as Crosby says, such rigidity kills creativity and keeps things stuck. As the book itself suggests, it's not just a book you read, it is a book you do. It's really a call to action.
Wow. What an incredibly rich deep dive into Gilmore Crosby's call for maybe a more effective approach to DEI. We've seen how unproductive dogma can be, really understood the crucial differences between definitions of racism, and explored Kurt Lewin's really powerful framework for systemic, action-oriented change.
Yeah, the core message seems undeniably clear. Addressing inequality truly requires moving beyond blame and shame, embracing genuine dialogue, real back and forth, and committing to concrete actions that dismantle the systemic issues. It really is all about collaboration, shared responsibility, and that common commitment to building alliances.
Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby, and I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T-group workshops. If you have never been in a T-group with us, then don't miss it in your life. Many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, a 2-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day. And I invite you to do the same. Together, we can create high productivity and morale in organizations. We can create stronger foundations for democracy. We can create a better world.